A quiet woman sat in seat 27C. Jeans. Sweater. Book. Completely forgettable. When the Boeing 777 lost 2 engines and started its death spiral toward the desert, she revealed herself. She executed an impossible landing on a highway. F-22 fighter pilots monitoring the emergency heard her call sign and went silent with shock. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Nobody noticed the woman in seat 27C. Not the flight attendant who served her water. Not the businessman who asked her to pass a blanket. Not the other passengers who thought she was just another traveler going home. She wore simple jeans and a gray sweater. Her dark hair was tied back. She had glasses on her nose as she read a book. She looked completely normal. Completely ordinary. The flight attendant smiled at her like she smiled at everyone else. The man next to her assumed she worked in an office somewhere. The elderly couple in front of her talked about their grandchildren. Nobody had any reason to think she was special. But they were all very wrong. What nobody on that plane knew was that this quiet woman had one of the most amazing military records in aviation history. Her file was locked away in classified databases. It contained mission reports that made experienced pilots shake their heads in wonder. She had flown in combat zones. She had logged over 4,000 flight hours in 15 different types of aircraft. She had survived situations that killed other pilots. She had done things that seemed impossible. Her specialty was bringing damaged aircraft home when everyone else said to abandon the plane. She flew rescue missions in weather that grounded entire squadrons. She made split-second decisions under enemy fire that saved countless lives. She had test-piloted experimental aircraft that pushed human limits. She had trained elite fighter pilots in advanced combat maneuvers. She had coordinated emergency responses during catastrophic incidents that would have ended in mass death without her intervention. Her call sign was legendary. It was known from military bases in America to bases in Europe and Asia. Fighter pilots spoke her name with deep respect. That call sign represented a night when she had flown a crippled fighter jet through a sandstorm with multiple systems failing and enemy missiles tracking her aircraft. The plane had been badly damaged. A crew member in the back seat was bleeding and dying. Everyone said the aircraft could not be flown. Everyone said she should eject and abandon the mission. Everyone said the plane was lost. But she brought that fighter jet home. She flew by instinct when instruments failed. She executed maneuvers that should not have been possible with a damaged plane. She landed the burning aircraft on a runway she could barely see through sand and smoke. The wounded officer survived because she refused to give up. The mission succeeded because she completed the objective even with half her systems dead. Her call sign became a symbol of never giving up. Of finding a way when no way existed. Of aviation mastery that separated legends from merely good pilots. But tonight, she was just another passenger. She had chosen this anonymity deliberately. No uniform. No medals. No mention of her background to the curious travelers around her. She wanted peace. She wanted to be normal. She wanted to be just another face in the crowd instead of the decorated hero whose reputation was known in every military circle. The Boeing 777 lifted off from Dallas-Fort Worth Airport at exactly 6:47 in the evening. It carried 183 people toward San Diego. It was supposed to be a completely normal flight. The woman in 27C ordered ginger ale when the drink cart came by. She said thank you quietly. She kept reading her book. The businessman beside her worked on his laptop. The elderly couple discussed their travel plans. Everything was peaceful. Everything was routine. The kind of boring flight that passengers forget the moment they land. The plane climbed smoothly through 35,000 feet. The seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers unbuckled to stretch. Some retrieved laptops. Some closed their eyes to sleep. The flight attendants prepared for the meal service. In the cockpit, the pilots ran through standard checks. They monitored fuel consumption. They checked weather reports. Everything looked perfect. Then at 7:42 in the evening, at 37,000 feet over the Texas desert, everything went catastrophically wrong. The first sign was a massive shuddering vibration that shook the entire plane. Overhead bins rattled violently. Loose items flew through the cabin. Before anyone could process what was happening, a deafening explosion tore through engine number 2. The Boeing 777 lurched violently to the right. Almost immediately, engine number 3 began showing critical failures on the cockpit instruments. The pilots fought the controls as multiple alarms screamed warnings. Engine fire. Hydraulic pressure loss. Flight control malfunction. Electrical system failure. The aircraft was literally falling apart in midair. Failures were spreading through the systems faster than the crew could respond. In the cabin, chaos erupted. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled bank that sent passengers sliding across tilted aisles. Flight attendants struggled to reach their emergency seats. The captain's strained voice came over the speakers ordering everyone into brace positions. His words were barely audible over screaming passengers and the horrible sound of metal tearing somewhere in the structure. The businessman in 27B clutched his armrest with white knuckles. His laptop crashed to the floor. The elderly couple held hands tightly and prayed. Their grandchildren's photos scattered from a falling purse. Throughout the cabin, 183 people faced the terrifying reality that their routine flight had become a death sentence. The ground was rushing up to meet them. These were their final moments. The woman in 27C moved with incredible speed and purpose. In one fluid motion, she dropped her book, unbuckled her seatbelt, and launched herself forward through the tilted cabin. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had trained for catastrophic emergencies. Someone who had faced disaster before. Her body automatically compensated for the violent movements of the aircraft. She grabbed seatbacks for stability and propelled herself toward the front of the plane. A flight attendant strapped into a jump seat watched in shock as this random passenger moved through the chaos with military precision. Nothing about her movements was panicked or uncertain. She reached the cockpit door just as it swung open. The first officer emerged wide-eyed to assess the damage in the cabin. She did not ask permission. "I am a pilot," she said. Her voice carried absolute authority that allowed no argument. "I can help. Let me in that cockpit right now." The first officer was drowning in alarms and cascading system failures. But he saw something in her eyes. A calm competence. An absolute certainty. It overrode every protocol about unauthorized people in the cockpit. He stepped aside. She pushed through the cockpit door and took in the entire situation with one sweeping glance. She processed information faster than conscious thought. Both pilots were fighting the controls. The captain was pulling the control column with both hands. The first officer worked the rudder pedals against the asymmetric thrust trying to roll the aircraft upside down. The primary flight display showed a death spiral. Altitude unwinding rapidly. Airspeed fluctuating wildly. The attitude indicators showed they were seconds from entering an unrecoverable dive. Engine 2 was completely destroyed. Its remains were dragging on the wing creating massive aerodynamic disruption. Engine 3 was failing. Oil pressure was dropping toward zero as internal components tore themselves apart. Engine 1 on the opposite wing was the only functioning engine. But its thrust was actually making the situation worse by pulling the aircraft into a spin. "Talk to me," she commanded. Her voice cut through the chaos with the tone of someone who had coordinated combat missions under fire. The captain was sweating as he fought controls that barely responded. He managed to gasp out the situation. "Lost 2 engines. Maybe losing 3. Hydraulics failing on 2 systems. Flight controls are degraded. We are at 32,000 feet and descending fast. Cannot maintain altitude. Cannot stop the roll. We are going down. She processed this information in milliseconds. Her mind automatically ran through emergency procedures that existed in classified training manuals most commercial pilots never saw. She had flown damaged aircraft before. She had brought home machines that were structurally compromised and aerodynamically impossible. She knew what the textbooks said about situations like this. But she also knew what the textbooks did not say. What could not be written in official procedures because it required instinct and feel. A level of aviation mastery that could not be taught in simulators. Throttle back engine 1, she ordered. Her hands were already reaching for controls. You are fighting asymmetric thrust. Kill your good engine. The captain's training screamed that this was insane. Reducing thrust on their only functioning engine would accelerate their descent. Every procedure said to maintain whatever power you had. But something in her voice made him obey. Some absolute certainty that broke through his panic and training. His hand moved to the throttle. Engine 1 spooled down. And miraculously, impossibly, the aircraft's roll began to slow. Without the asymmetric thrust pulling them into a spin, the degraded flight controls suddenly had a chance to work. The woman's hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision. Her fingers danced over controls as she manually adjusted trim settings that the damaged flight computers could not automatically compensate for. She was flying by feel. Using stick and rudder fundamentals that dated back to the earliest days of aviation. Treating the massive Boeing 777 like a vintage aircraft that required constant manual correction. Restart engine 1 at 20% thrust, she said. Her voice was absolutely calm even as the ground continued rushing toward them. We need just enough power for control authority. Not enough to roll us. The first officer's hands trembled as he worked the engine restart procedure. He brought the big turbofan back to life at barely above idle power. The aircraft was still descending. Still wounded. But suddenly it was descending in a somewhat controlled manner rather than an uncontrolled death spiral. She studied the terrain display. She processed options with the tactical awareness of someone who had planned combat missions in hostile territory. They were over West Texas desert. Sparsely populated but with limited options for emergency landing sites. The nearest airport with a runway long enough for a 777 was El Paso International. But they were losing altitude too fast to make it. They had maybe 4 minutes before they would be forced to put down wherever they could find ground flat enough to attempt a crash landing. There, she said, pointing at the terrain display where a long straight line appeared in the desert. That is Interstate 10. 8 lanes wide. Mostly straight. Light traffic this time of evening. We are going to put this aircraft on that highway. The pilot stared at her like she had lost her mind. Landing a Boeing 777 on a highway was insane. Something that existed only in Hollywood movies. Not in any actual emergency procedure manual. The aircraft's wingspan was 200 feet across. Wider than the entire interstate including shoulders. The approach would have to be impossibly precise. Threading the needle between overpasses. Avoiding power lines with no margin for error and no opportunity for a second attempt if the approach went wrong. And they would have to do it with degraded flight controls, failing hydraulics, and an airframe that was barely holding together. It was absolutely impossible. She had done impossible before. I need you to trust me, she said, looking directly at the captain. Her eyes had seen combat. Had stared down death and refused to blink. I have landed damaged aircraft in worse conditions than this. I know what I am doing. But I need you both to follow my instructions exactly. Without hesitation. Without second guessing. Can you do that? The captain faced certain death if he continued flying conventionally. Possible survival if he trusted this mysterious woman who had appeared in his cockpit. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He nodded. "She has the aircraft," he said formally. The traditional transfer of command that gave her legal authority to control the flight. "I have the aircraft," she confirmed. Her hands settled onto the controls with impossible confidence. The next 3 minutes and 40 seconds became aviation legend. A masterclass in emergency flying that would be studied in flight schools for decades to come. She flew the crippled 777 with a combination of instinct and precision that seemed almost supernatural. Making constant tiny adjustments to trim and throttle that kept the asymmetric airframe from rolling into another uncontrolled descent. She talked the first officer through manually extending the landing gear using the emergency backup system, knowing they would need every bit of drag and stability for the approach. She had the captain coordinate with air traffic control, declaring an emergency and getting Interstate 10 cleared of traffic. State police and emergency responders scrambled to set up a crash response along the highway. In the cabin, flight attendants prepared passengers for crash landing procedures, demonstrating brace positions and evacuation procedures while trying to maintain calm despite their own terror. The woman's voice came over the speaker system. No longer the anonymous passenger in 27C but now the commanding presence coordinating their survival. "This is the pilot. We have experienced multiple engine failures and are making an emergency landing on Interstate 10. The landing will be rough. Follow your flight attendant's instructions exactly. Brace for impact when commanded. We are going to get through this." Something in her voice gave 183 terrified people a reason to hope. She lined up the approach with precision that seemed impossible given the degraded flight controls and wounded airframe. The interstate stretched ahead like a narrow ribbon, bounded by desert scrub and occasional overpasses that represented obstacles they would have to clear with almost no margin for error. She came in low and slow. The aircraft's massive wings extended beyond the highway's edge. Wing tips passed within feet of light poles and road signs. The landing gear touched asphalt at 140 knots. Far faster than normal landing speed but the slowest she could manage with the damaged aircraft. The impact was brutal. Passengers slammed forward against restraints as the landing gear screamed against highway asphalt never designed for aircraft loads. Tires exploded from the excessive speed and weight. Rubber fragments spun into the desert. The aircraft bounced once. Twice. Threatening to porpoise back into the air where she would lose all control. She worked throttle and stick with microscopic precision. Bleeding off energy. Keeping the wings level. Refusing to let the wounded aircraft get away from her. The Boeing 777 scraped along Interstate 10 for nearly a mile, leaving a trail of torn asphalt and sparking metal. Finally grinding to a stop straddling the westbound lanes. Its wing tips hanging over the desert on either side. Emergency evacuation slides deployed automatically. Flight attendants began the practiced chaos of evacuating 183 passengers from an aircraft that might explode or catch fire at any moment. People poured down the slides onto highway asphalt. Many were crying. Some were in shock. All were incredibly and miraculously alive despite having just survived a crash landing that should have killed them all. She stayed in the cockpit until every passenger was clear, helping the captain and first officer secure the aircraft and shut down the remaining systems. Only when the last passenger had been evacuated did she emerge from the cockpit. Still wearing her gray sweater and faded jeans. Looking like she had just finished a routine commute rather than executing one of the most extraordinary emergency landings in aviation history. The elderly couple from row 26 grabbed her in tearful embrace. Not caring who she was. Only knowing she had saved their lives and given them a chance to see their grandchildren again. The businessman from 27B stood staring at the woman who had been sitting next to him reading a book. Unable to process that the quiet passenger he had asked to pass him a blanket had just landed a crippled aircraft on a highway and saved everyone aboard. As emergency vehicles surrounded the crashed aircraft and paramedics began checking passengers for injuries, military aircraft that had been scrambled from nearby Air Force bases circled overhead. Standard protocol for major aviation emergencies included military oversight. Coordination between civilian and military air traffic control. Fighter aircraft providing tactical support if needed. 2 F-22 Raptors from the 49th Fighter Wing at Holloman Air Force Base had been monitoring the emergency. Tracking the crippled 777 on their advanced radar systems. Coordinating with civilian authorities. The F-22 pilots had watched the impossible landing on their displays. Seen an aircraft that should have crashed succeed in an emergency procedure that violated every conventional wisdom about crash survivability. They were already discussing the miraculous landing over secure military channels when the emergency coordinators began processing identification information on the pilot who had taken control and executed the landing. Her name entered the military database. Cross-referenced with personnel files. Matched to service records. And her call sign appeared on the F-22 pilot's displays. The secure military channel went completely silent. The F-22 Raptor pilots flying the most advanced stealth fighters ever built froze in their cockpits for 10 full seconds. Neither pilot said a word. They simply stared at the call sign displayed on their instruments. A call sign they had heard whispered with reverence in ready rooms and officers' clubs. A call sign that represented achievements so legendary that most pilots assumed the stories were exaggerated. That nobody could actually be that good. But here was the verification. The official confirmation that the woman who had just saved 183 lives on a highway in West Texas carried a call sign that commanded such profound respect that even F-22 pilots could barely comprehend they were in the presence of such aviation mastery. Confirm that call sign, the lead F-22 pilot finally managed. His voice was tight with disbelief. Are we seeing what I think we are seeing? The tactical coordinator at the Military Emergency Response Center double-checked the data. Equally stunned by what the database was showing. Confirmed. Call sign is authentic. That is actually her. The F-22 pilots exchanged glances across the formation. Even though they could not see each other's expressions through helmets and oxygen masks, they both knew exactly what the other was thinking. They were witnessing aviation history. The woman standing on that Texas highway in civilian clothes was a living legend whose achievements made their own considerable skills pale in comparison. The secure military channel transmitted back to the Emergency Coordination Center where military liaisons were coordinating with civilian authorities. The F-22 pilot's voice carried a tone of absolute reverence rarely heard in fighter-pilot communications. Be advised, the pilot who executed that emergency landing is designated by call sign. He spoke her call sign with weight and respect. Repeat, that is confirmed call sign for the aviator on scene. Request to extend our patrol for security support. That legend does not go anywhere without proper respect. Military personnel at the coordination center reacted with similar shock and recognition. Many of them were pilots themselves. Her call sign meant something. Represented achievements that transcended normal military service. Embodied the kind of aviation excellence that inspired young pilots and humbled experienced ones. On the highway, as paramedics checked passengers and news helicopters began circling overhead, the woman in the gray sweater stood talking quietly with FAA investigators who had already arrived on scene. She was explaining the emergency procedures she had executed. Walking through her decision-making process with the same calm clarity she had shown in the cockpit. The captain and first officer stood nearby. Still processing the fact that a random passenger had saved their lives and the lives of everyone aboard. "Who are you?" the captain finally asked. The question that had been building since she had walked into his cockpit and taken command with such absolute authority. She hesitated. Maintaining the privacy she had carefully cultivated. The separation between her military service and civilian life. But the elderly couple was listening. And the businessmen. And flight attendants. And a growing crowd of survivors who wanted to know the identity of the woman who had given them back their lives. "I am retired military," she said simply. Offering the minimum explanation. "I have some aviation experience. Some aviation experience, the first officer repeated. His voice edged with something between laughter and tears. You just landed a Boeing 777 on a highway with multiple engine failures and degraded flight controls. That is not some experience. That is. He trailed off. Not sure how to finish the sentence. The businessman from 27B pulled out his phone and started searching. Piecing together clues from the conversations around them. From the military aircraft overhead. From the way official personnel were looking at her with unmistakable recognition. His search led him to declassified military reports. To aviation history articles. To stories about a legendary pilot whose call sign represented achievements that seemed impossible. His phone screen showed her call sign with articles describing missions and accomplishments that read like fiction. He looked up at the woman in the gray sweater. Then back at his phone. Then up again. You are her, he said. His voice rising with realization. The pilot from. I read about the mission where you. He could not finish. Overwhelmed by the reality that he had been sitting next to aviation royalty for an entire boarding process without having any idea. Other passengers began pulling out phones. Searching. Discovering. Passing information through the growing crowd of survivors. The elderly woman from row 26 read an article about a combat mission where this woman had saved multiple lives under impossible conditions. She began crying again. This time from the overwhelming realization of who had just saved her life. The F-22 Raptors made another pass overhead. Their stealth profiles barely visible in the darkening sky. The lead pilot's voice came over the civilian emergency radio channel. A breach of normal protocol, but one he clearly felt compelled to make. Interstate 10 emergency site, this is Raptor flight. We have confirmed the identity of your pilot. Be advised you have a national treasure on that highway. Her call sign is known and respected throughout the entire military aviation community. Request permission to provide aerial honor escort as she is transported to debriefing. The request was unprecedented. F-22 pilots offering to provide escort for a civilian emergency. But the tactical coordinator approved it immediately. Recognizing the significance of what had just occurred. As news helicopters broadcast footage of the crashed 777 on the highway, word spread through military channels about who had executed the impossible landing. Phones began ringing in the Pentagon. At Air Force bases around the world. In ready rooms where pilots gathered to watch the unfolding story. Her call sign appeared in news reports. In military communications. In social media posts from aviation enthusiasts who recognized what her designation meant. The legend she had maintained such privacy around became unavoidably public as 183 survivors wanted the world to know that they owed their lives to one of the greatest aviators in history. She stood on that Texas highway as emergency vehicle lights painted the scene in red and blue. As survivors embraced their families over phone calls. As military aircraft circled overhead in unprecedented tribute. And she accepted that her anonymity was gone. The captain approached her with formal bearing. Extending his hand in a gesture that transcended simple gratitude. I do not know what protocol is for thanking someone for saving 183 lives, he said. But whatever it is inadequate. You gave all of us a future we should not have had. You gave parents more time with their children. Gave those grandparents more years to see their family grow. Gave every person on that aircraft the rest of their lives. How do you thank someone for that? She took his hand. This woman whose call sign commanded such respect that F-22 pilots froze in awe. Whose achievements filled classified reports and inspired young aviators. Whose combat record read like legend made real. You do what I did, she said simply. You refuse to accept that the situation is impossible. You find a way when no way exists. You bring everyone home. It was the philosophy that had defined her career. That had earned her the call sign now being spoken with reverence around the world. That had just saved 183 lives against impossible odds. The businessman from 27B approached with obvious hesitation. "I asked you to pass me a blanket," he said. The mundane request now seeming absurd given what he had learned. "I had no idea I was sitting next to." He gestured helplessly, unable to articulate the magnitude of who she was. She smiled. The same easy smile she had offered when answering questions about her travel plans. When declining snacks. When being treated as just another anonymous passenger. "That was the point," she said. "I was not trying to be special. I was just trying to get home." But the universe had other plans. The mysterious woman in seat 27C who read books and wore gray sweaters had been revealed as one of the most legendary aviators in military history. A pilot whose call sign represented achievements that most aviators could only dream of matching. The F-22 Raptors circled overhead. Their pilot still processing the reality that they had just witnessed her execute another impossible feat, that the stories they had heard about her were not exaggerated but understated. Throughout military aviation communities worldwide, pilots who had studied her missions and revered her call sign now had a new story to add to her legend. The night she saved 183 lives on a Texas highway. Executing an emergency landing that should not have been possible. Proving once again that her reputation was earned through skill that transcended normal human ability. As investigators began the long process of documenting the emergency and examining the crashed aircraft, as survivors were transported to hospitals for evaluation and news crews broadcast the miraculous story worldwide, the woman who had been anonymous passenger 27C stood surrounded by people whose lives she had saved. Accepting gratitude she had not sought. Recognition she had deliberately avoided. Her call sign appeared in headlines. In military communications. In conversations among aviators who understood exactly what it meant to achieve the impossible. 3 days after the emergency landing, a ceremony was quietly arranged at a secure military facility. The 183 survivors were invited along with their families to meet the woman who had given them their futures back. She arrived in her Air Force dress uniform for the first time since the emergency. Her chest displaying ribbons and medals that told stories of valor most civilians could not fully comprehend. The elderly couple from row 26 brought their grandchildren, wanting them to meet a real hero. The businessman from 27B brought his daughter, explaining that the quiet woman who had sat beside him was the reason he would be there to walk her down the aisle at her wedding next month. Flight attendants who had prepared passengers for what they thought would be certain death stood in formation, saluting a fellow aviation professional whose skill had validated their emergency training and given meaning to procedures they had practiced but never expected to use successfully. The F-22 pilots from that night attended in their flight suits. These warriors of the sky standing at attention with genuine reverence for someone whose achievements eclipsed their own considerable skills. When she entered the room, 183 people who had faced death together rose as one. Their applause thundered through the facility. She stood before them. This legend whose call sign was known worldwide. Whose combat record inspired young aviators. Whose emergency landing had just added another chapter to an already extraordinary career. "I did not save you alone," she said. Her voice carrying the same calm authority that had coordinated the impossible landing. "The captain and first officer trusted me when every instinct said not to. The flight attendants kept you calm and focused. You followed instructions when panic would have been understandable. We saved each other through teamwork. Through trust. Through refusing to give up." She paused. "That is what my call sign really means. Not individual achievement, but the absolute commitment to bringing everyone home together." Her words resonated through the crowd. But everyone present understood the truth. That without her specific skills, her impossible mastery, her refusal to accept defeat, none of them would be standing there. The businessman's daughter would have grown up without a father. The grandchildren would have lost their grandparents. 183 futures would have ended on a Texas highway. Instead, they had been given the gift of tomorrow. The chance to continue their stories. All because anonymous passenger 27C turned out to be a legend who proved that her reputation was earned through achievements that transcended fiction and became reality when lives hung in the balance. The military debriefing that followed became classified material studied at the Air Force Academy and Naval Postgraduate School for generations. Aviation experts from the National Transportation Safety Board analyzed every second of the emergency landing frame by frame, trying to understand how she had achieved control authority with systems that should have made the aircraft completely unflyable. Senior test pilots from Edwards Air Force Base reviewed her decision to throttle back the functioning engine. A counterintuitive move that saved everyone but went against every instinct trained into commercial pilots. The consensus among experts was unanimous and humbling. No other pilot they knew could have executed what she accomplished. The specific combination of combat experience, test pilot precision, tactical decision-making under extreme stress, and pure stick and rudder mastery required to land that crippled 777 on a highway existed in perhaps a handful of aviators worldwide. And she was definitively one of them. She had traveled as a civilian, dressed in jeans and a sweater, deliberately maintaining separation between her extraordinary military service and her desire for normal life. But when 183 lives hung in the balance, when conventional procedures failed and disaster seemed certain, she had done what she had always done. Refused to accept defeat. Found a way where none existed. Brought everyone home through sheer skill and absolute mastery of aviation. Her call sign, spoken with reverence by F-22 pilots who literally froze in awe when they heard it, would forever be associated with the night she saved 183 lives on a Texas highway. The legend had grown. The reputation enhanced. But she remained fundamentally unchanged. A pilot who refused to accept impossible. Who brought everyone home no matter the odds. Whose call sign represented not just past achievements but an ongoing commitment to excellence that transcended normal human capability. She had been anonymous passenger 27C. Overlooked and unremarkable. She became the pilot who saved everyone. Whose call sign commanded such respect that the best aviators in the world stopped and acknowledged they were in the presence of true mastery. And through it all, she remained who she had always been. Someone who simply refused to let anyone down. Who found ways when no way existed. Who embodied everything that her legendary call sign represented. The quiet woman in the gray sweater reading a book. The decorated combat pilot with thousands of flight hours. The legend whose name made F-22 pilots freeze in recognition. They were all the same person. Someone who understood that true heroism is not about seeking glory or recognition. It is about doing what needs to be done when lives depend on it. About refusing to give up when giving up would be easier. About having the skill and courage to attempt the impossible and the determination to succeed. Her story spread around the world. Not just among military communities but among ordinary people who were inspired by what she represented. Parents told their children about the woman who saved 183 lives. Teachers used her story as an example of excellence and dedication. Young pilots dreamed of one day earning even a fraction of the respect her call sign commanded. The businessman from 27B never forgot that he had sat next to greatness without recognizing it. He learned to look deeper. To understand that extraordinary people often hide in plain sight. The elderly couple told their grandchildren about the angel who gave them more years together. About the pilot who refused to let them die. The flight attendants returned to work with renewed purpose. Knowing that their training mattered. That emergency procedures existed for a reason. That miracles could happen when skilled people refused to give up. The captain and first officer flew again. But they never forgot the moment they handed control to a passenger and watched her do the impossible. On that Texas highway, under the circling F-22 Raptors, surrounded by 183 people who owed her their lives, she had finally stepped into the light. Her anonymity was gone. Her legend was public. Her call sign was known not just in military circles but around the world. But the most important thing remained unchanged. She was still the person who would do whatever it took to bring everyone home. Who would refuse to accept impossible? Who would find a way when no way existed? That was what her call sign truly represented. Not just past achievements but a promise. A commitment. A standard that she held herself to every single day. When you wear a call sign like hers, you carry the weight of expectation. The knowledge that people look up to you. That your name means something. She had earned that call sign through actions that became legend. Through missions that seemed impossible. Through a career of excellence that inspired generations. And on a Texas highway, with a crippled aircraft and 183 lives in the balance, she proved once again that legends are not built on stories. They are built on the actions of extraordinary people who refuse to let others down. The woman in seat 27C was just trying to get home. Instead, she saved 183 lives and reminded the world what true excellence looks like. Her call sign will be remembered forever. Not because of what it says about her past. But because of what it promises about who she is and who she will always be. A legend who earned every bit of respect that name commands.